Okay, welcome back, everyone. So this one might be a long one. Um, where this particular PowerPoint, this final segment in our World War I lecture series is going to discuss the conclusion of the war. This one's going to take, once again, the character of a world history class to a greater extent than the last two segments, because this is an American history class. But it just so happens, as the United States becomes a world power, it's to be expected that American history becomes world history becomes American history. That's part and parcel when you move up in the ranks, if you will, and you become a world power. We're going to be looking at a lot of maps, and this one might be a long one. This one is kind of dense. So we're going to start here with Armistice Day. We used to celebrate it until we turned it into Veterans Day and kind of changed its meaning because we already had a day to remember the fallen in war, which was Memorial Day, and that was established um, by President Lincoln at the Civil War. So I kind of get it, having both a Memorial Day and an Armistice Day is kind of redundant. 2 days out of the year to recognize service members that had fallen in war. So to give Armistice Day another spin, they called it Veterans Day. So Memorial Day is for those that have died in service to their country. But Veterans Day is recognizing all veterans, not necessarily those that have fallen. So, it was redundant in the American case, and that's why we changed. We didn't change the day. We kind of retconned the meaning, if you will. But I think the question I asked you at the end is like, wow, why all of a sudden this the Germans were still inside France. Yeah, they were up against the ropes. Okay, they were in the Argonne Forest. They had yet been pushed into Belgium, despite the severity of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. They were still holding their ground. What happens? Why the abrupt end in November 11th? And you'd be surprised how often conflicts end this way, having nothing to do with the soldiers in the front line, that despite deprivations, despite the lack of everything, and I'm thinking about, the battles of Petersburg, for example, you still had men there willing to give their lives. Um, Surprisingly, events as they unfold back home quite often are the true events that lead these conflicts to the end. Despite you still have plenty of soldiers on the front line that are willing to die to the fight to the bitter end, even if it means the end of their lives, which was true for the Germans. That it was events as they unfolded in Berlin. What were these events? Well, at the last minute, the government that had initiated the war, that had led, well, again, we're blaming the Germans. That's not true. The government that, at least on the German side, had orchestrated Germany's entry into this war, Germany's involvement in this war, and then Germany would take the lead in this war. That's absolutely true. And the government that governed Germany and led the Central Powers war effort, well, this government, after much pressure, many protests, incredible deprivations on the German people, food shortages got to the point that there was outright hunger, not just throughout Germany, but in the Central Powers, in part because of the blockade. Um, this general overall unraveling of order and the ability of the Kaiser's government to keep control, much less continue to fight a war that at this point was a lost cause. Well, things in Berlin fall apart. Wilhelm II, with his closest generals and his family, having already discussed um, going into exile with the government of the Netherlands, does exactly that. Instead of suffering the consequences of the end of the war, um, alongside of everybody else that played a leading role in this war, he decides to cut and run for Netherlands, where the government of the Netherlands granted him immunity and exile. And he leaves a vacuum. Okay. Who fills in that vacuum? That's a complicated story in itself. But the government that sued for peace, the government that filled that void in Berlin is not the same government that spearheaded this war. On the contrary, it was quite often the political opposition to the war. Okay. It was many people that were in opposition to the war and opposition to the, if not to the war itself, to the Kaiser and the Kaiser's continued governance over Germany. These were the ones that fill the vacuum when the Kaiser leaves. Okay, and it's a little bit complicated. And these are the ones that sue for peace. That's why the abrupt end at November 11th. So let's talk about how things are starting to unravel. Once news reaches Berlin, all these things are compounded. The lack of food, okay? The inability of the overland supply route that runs through the Ottoman Empire to maintain the Central Powers supplied, plus the naval blockade the British have set up on the German coast, have led to great deprivations, unrest, food riots inside Germany, and then with the failure of the spring offensive, you would have to be, in complete denial. How does Germany squeeze a victory out of this? It does not. So what is next? Okay. Do we continue to fight and let the Germans and let the British and the French march into German soil? Or do we dictate the terms of the end of this war? We're going to talk more about this because there's a lot of argument about just exactly how did Germany lose this war? Did she surrender or did she simply not win the war? So everybody's happy. American boys are going to be going back home to prohibition. Okay. So there's a lot to be said about the American experience in France, however brief that it was, both the white experience and the black experience. The black experience is very interesting. Many of these soldiers discover a newfound willingness to assert themselves against white supremacy in the United States. Having been exposed to broaden their horizons and exposed to a much bigger world, and in this case, French society and French white society not being as outright hostile towards them, many returning African American troops take this experience. Many claim that the birth of the modern civil rights movement started there. The and then the white experience is going to be interesting too. A lot of the liberties that we're used to enjoying in France are going to be gone, and culturally there's going to be a change. There's a lot of interesting stories that you can look it up for yourself. I used to say this in class, but we don't really have the time. A lot of interesting cultural changes took place when American soldiers experienced certain cultural differences between American culture and French culture, and then took a lot of these differences home, and they've actually become the norm today. For example, the shaving of legs that did not exist. Nobody shaved their legs 100 years ago. Sorry, kids. We may have thought that always was the case and that it was always the norm. Nobody shaved their legs 100 years ago. Okay? That custom began in France for particular purposes. I think you should look this up on your own. And made its way to the United States and in the broader world, and then became this cultural norm that nobody questions. The same thing as makeup. So many cultural things that we have that we accept. Oh, it's always been the case. No, it hasn't. I'm going to let you guys research that one on your own. It is a little adulty. It can go in that direction. It's funny, that's adulty, but wholesale war and genocide and violence on a mass scale, that's not adulty. That's perfectly fine. But those are the contradictions that we navigate on a constant basis. So what exactly? Meanwhile, back in Germany, what was going on in the German Empire after the end of the Spring Offensive that eventually led to the abrupt end of the war? The Kaiser leaves. That's true. The German Revolution of 1918 through 1919. That vacuum is going to be filled by opposition to the Kaiser, but it is not a united, those that fill that vacuum are not on the same page. kind of got to go back to the war. The Kaiser did not rule absolutely and dictatorially. Okay. Uh, the Reichstag, which was legislative body, more of a council to the Kaiser. There's a little political history here. The most popular the most popular political party in Germany from the inception of Germany was the Social Democratic Party, Socialist Party in the European vague. And actually they began with very radical roots. They were born in the 1840s and they were very much a Marxist party. Although by the time you get to the First World War, they had dropped most of their Marxist socialism and adopted a more evolutionary, we could create socialism through electoral politics kind of position. Um, when it came time to go to war, when the Reichstag voted on the war, the SDP, which was, this is interesting because this goes all the way into World War II. They're the most popular party in Germany from Germany's inception until 1933, by the way. If you want to know why the Nazis, the National Socialist Workers' Party, even adopted that the name socialist in their party name, it was to co-opt and steal support from the SDP by pandering to some platform positions that were popular among those that held socialist political views in Germany at the time. But by no ways were they a socialist party. They were a conservative right-wing party. Because the Social Democrats voted to go to war, to support the war, there was a split in the party. Okay? There's a split in the party. So the Social Democrats voted on behalf of the war, which kind of set them apart from all other socialist parties. This is a split in the socialist community, not just in Europe, but in the United States as well. When all of the mainstream socialists decided to go ahead and vote to support the war, there were splits in just about every one of these parties, and the communists, to differentiate themselves from the socialists, would walk away from those parties, their central position being opposition to the war, because this was a war of empire, of imperialist, of capitalism, a war raged for land and resources. Interestingly enough, the founder of the SDP was a man named Walter Liebknecht. His son would lead the splintering of the SDP. His son would lead the German Communist Party, the Spartacists, and break away from the SDP. So this is important. On November 9th, 1918, when the Kaiser leaves, a couple of days before, when the Kaiser leaves, um, two groups, the two most powerful political groups in Germany, declare themselves the new provisional government. The SDP, the Social Democrats, from the Reichstag itself, declare themselves the new provisional government of Germany, and that Germany is no longer the German Empire. Germany is a republic. Well, their competition, the Spartacists, which were the German Communist Party, were like, what the hell? You unilaterally made this decision. So 2 hours later, a couple of blocks away at Berlin Castle, which was basically a city hall, Karl Liebknecht, okay, one of the leaders of the Spartacists, um, declares the communists to be the true provisional government of Germany and declares Germany a socialist republic. So Kaiser leaves, vacuum is left open. Two groups claim to be the new provisional government of Germany. Okay. Which of the two do you think the Triple Entente is actually going to listen to and recognize as the new legitimate provisional government? Well, that's going to cause even greater tension. Okay. This is an interesting period in German history because it almost looks like, for the same conditions, the war, it almost looks like Germany is going to fall in the same footsteps as Russia exactly 1 year earlier. Okay? A provisional government, a split in that provisional government between the mainstream left and the further left, and it's going to boil over into violence. So it does boil over into outright violence. Let me talk about the two leaders, Spartacist. Um, Karl Liebknecht, who was the son of Walter Liebknecht, one of the founders of the SPD, and Rosa Luxemburg, socialist theorist, very critical of Lenin, but nonetheless, they're looking at Russia to lead the way, to grant them support to repeat what happened in Germany, what happened in Russia a year earlier. Already, the German Republic that was set up in the wake of the Kaiser's absence, they have already lost 3 states. Well, 3 provinces. They have a different word for it. The establishment of the Soviet Republic of Saxony was set up in November of 1918. It's going to last for about a month. The Bremen Soviet Republic is going to set up in January. It's going to last until February. And then the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which is interesting, that's all the way in the south of Germany, the most conservative part of Germany. And they're going to last about a month too, before they are crushed and brought back into the German state. And it's interesting. Many of the folks that fought on the side of the right-wing paramilitaries that would crush the Bavarian Soviet Republic would move on to be high-ranking members of the Nazi Party. So Liebknecht tries to pull a Lenin. He tries to pull a October Revolution on January of 1918 and calls for a mass demonstration and general strike on January 4th. This is called the Spartacus Uprising, in an effort, just like Lenin did in Russia, to depose the Ebert government, who was the ruling provisional government, the Social Democrats. He's able to pour, Liebknecht and Luxemburg, the leaders of the uprising, are able to pour hundreds of thousands into the streets of Berlin and several cities. They are armed demonstrators. In Lenin fashion, he's telling them to take control of government buildings and therefore deny access to the apparatus of government to the Ebert government, and demands the resignation of the SPD, and the formation of a new provisional government, which of course would be the German communists, the Spartacists. So how does the SPD and Ebert survive this? They make a pact. Returning from the war, paramilitary organizations were being formed in the wake of the lack of the absence of a formal German army. The Freikorps, they were called, the Freikorps, which were very conservative, very right-wing, very anti-Bolshevik. And basically, the socialists make a deal with the right. Okay, if you help us crush the communists, help us prevent Germany from following in the footsteps from that Russia did, you'll get a seat at the table and we will govern Germany together. And that's exactly what happens. Ebert Sixth, the right-wing conservative Freikorps, they look for on the demonstrators. An order is given out to find the leaders of the Spartacists, which is Rosa Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Both were found, and basically, Rosa Luxemburg was beaten to death with the butts of rifles from soldiers, executed and thrown in the canal. And that was the end of the Spartacus Uprising, which is interesting. Ebert bought a temporary alliance with the conservative Freikorps to eliminate his further left opponents. The Spartacists bring a Spartacus uprising to the end and the possibility of Germany following the footsteps of Russia, but give them until 1933, and those very Freikorps wearing different uniforms are going to turn on the SPD as well and chase them out of the country. And that was how the German Revolution played out. What you need to know, almost followed the footsteps of the Soviet Union, but did not because of a alliance of convenience between the extreme right Freikorps and the Social Democrats under the government of Ebert that wanted to eliminate their further left opponents, the Spartacists. Let's talk about numbers. Let's talk about the overall numbers and cost of this war. This war lasted 4 years. There's some numbers here. They might not match with the numbers later on in different slides. 18 million deaths. That's a number that, the world is going to take a while to wrap their heads around. A third of them civilians. Uh, 23 million wounded. Talk about severely wounded. This is the birth of prosthetics, by the way. And if we were to count wounded the way we count today, for example, what we call PTSD, psychiatry was a new science that had emerged. World War I is the first conflict in which we begin to look at and take seriously the psychological toll of warfare on soldiers. At the time, they called it shell shock. Shell shock. So, World War I gives us the first real serious interest and study of trauma caused by war. And we didn't look at it back then, but those wounded numbers are much higher than 23 million. Particularly the men that were exposed to, on the artillery lines and the constant sonic boom of artillery firing and shells blowing up. Yes, there was probably millions more that suffered brain damage, okay? Neurological brain damage because of the concussive force of these explosives. The war would cost the world $186 billion. That's the equivalent of $4.7 trillion in 2019. That's an incredible amount of money. We just rounded to 5 trillion. Um, as we can see from that pie chart down there, triple entente total deaths did outstrip Central Powers' death. And just like World War II, it's because of the Russian front. The Russian front took many more casualties than any of the other fronts in this war. Food shortages, this was a factor that ultimately played a role in the German government capitulating on November 11th. In that there was severe shortages of food. And this is going to play a large role in World War II, by the way. Germany dealt with serious food shortages, as did France. That's because, agricultural production was severely curtailed in the north of France because it was an open war zone. Other countries faced, even more serious food shortages to the point of, famine-like conditions. Um, the Austrians, the Italians, most of Russia, but when you get into the Baltics, where the Germans occupied, okay, as well as Romania and Serbia, this is where you get outright famine-like conditions, of course, because the Germans were the occupiers. Whatever food was available, guess where it was going? It was going to the occupiers. And the Germans did the same thing in Belgium. The Belgians aren't going to get that food. It's the German troops in northern France that are going to get that food. So food shortages played a huge psychological role, okay, in the outcome of this war. And directs much of the attitude towards food in World War II of the players in that conflict. If we focus solely on military deaths, on the Entente side, yes, Russians make up 30%, but the French are not that far behind, 25% of total deaths. Look at the United States, 2%. But of course, that's understandable. The United States was only actively involved in this war for, let me see, from May to the first week or two of November of 1918. If we look at the Central Powers, 52% of it is Germany. Okay, who was fighting a two-front war? I'm surprised the Turks were only at 10% since they were fighting a multiple front war, but the intensity of those fronts was not the same as the intensity on the Russian front or on the Western front. Before we leave this slide, I want you to look at that picture in the foreground. Some of you are familiar. Armistice Day is usually symbolized with the wearing of red poppies throughout Europe. So what is the significance of red poppies? Strange reason. All across the Western Front, once the war was, hostilities were declared, done and over with, and the troops withdrew back to their corners, if you will, a strange thing happened. All across the Western Front, red poppies started to emerge and filled the fields from one side to the other. Many, added, spiritual. It's a message. Blah blah blah. This is the blood of the soldiers, whose blood was shed on this ground to remind us never to do this again. Because of course there is an extremely powerful anti-war sentiment going around the world at this time. Science tells us all that foot traffic and vehicle traffic across the Western Front actually had the effect of aerating the soil. Aerating the soil not only made the soil more fertile, but further spread out the seedlings that eventually lead to red poppies. So there's always a rational explanation to everything that kind of ruins the story, but that's what it was. Let's look at another graph here. It is one worth pausing. Numbers of deaths in World War I. And it's broken down by percent of the population. That number does not match the graph, by the way. So take that as you will. The Russians, 2.8 million people, and they're not done dying. That's just World War I. If we add the Russian Civil War, that's several million more. Okay. The Turks, not far behind, 2.8 million. Okay, according to this graph, the Turks had an even larger number of casualties. And the Germans, they're in the 2 million club, but not quite like the Russians, 2.1, almost 2.2 million. The Austrians, 1.7, almost 1.8 million. The Italians, 1 million men. The French, 1.6 million. The British did not even approach 1 million, 867,000. I mean, I'm treating these numbers, these are not casual numbers. These are human beings. These are brothers. These are friends. These are fathers. These are sons. We're tempted because the number kind of like boggles the mind to look at them like statistics, but every one of those numbers was a human being. Okay? I think what we're looking at here is total military and civilian casualties. More than 41 million. So that's why we get such high numbers. Even the minor players, the Greeks, I should mention this, did enter the war on the side of the Entente to open up a front against the Turks. The Serbians, the Romanians, they were all involved in this war as well. Even Portugal. The only ones that sidestepped this war were the Spanish and the Scandinavians, and the Dutch, and the Danes. Okay, there you go. Those are the ones that did not play a role in this war. And we haven't even talked about the African front or the the Pacific front either. This is an American history class. Total American Expeditionary Force casualties, killed in action, 53,400. Vast majority of those bodies actually were buried in France, stayed there. Non-combat deaths actually were more than the combat-related deaths. But that's not uncommon. That's not uncommon the further back we go in war. Okay? Not uncommon. Many men, non-combat deaths. Accidents happen. Wounded, 204,000. Okay. So for our brief period in combat, It was a measurable number of casualties. Here's an interesting picture. I believe it's in New York City. A put together memorial where they stacked up German helmets into the form of a pyramid. You know, that pyramid doesn't exist anymore. I'm assuming somebody pulled out the wrong helmet. And let's see if, this is going to be a longer PowerPoint because this one actually deserves our full attention and probably one of the most consequential moments of the 20th century. And you would be surprised to what extent it still defines the world that we live in today, meaning the world as it looks like today. To this day, it's still very much defined by what happened at Versailles, starting in June of 1919. This is the official, not surrender, but this is the treaty that officializes the terms of Germany's surrender in this war. Here are the big four. Here are the big four. The only ones there that technically and officially were members of the Triple Entente was Clemenceau and Lloyd George, Great Britain and France. Italy's Orlando, Woodrow Wilson from the United States, they were referred to as associate powers. And I put the big four on the screen because these are the four that are going to play a larger than life role, okay, during the Treaty of Versailles. But representatives from a number of countries are going to show up in Versailles, hoping to direct and get something out of the ongoing negotiations. We're already hitting the 32-minute mark. I think we have to split this presentation in two, since I don't want to go into an hour long. Let's talk about the cost of the war. In 1919 dollars, incredibly expensive. Um, Long story short, just about every participant in that war spent everything they had. They depleted their gold reserves. They spent themselves into bankruptcy. And yet, needing to continue this war, they had to borrow money. Great Britain, um, this they $35 billion, which you could do the math. How much does that turn out to be in 2020 dollars? It's exponentially more. Exponentially more. The French spent $24 billion, and the United States, despite our brief involvement, spent $23 billion. And then there's also money borrowed. Since the only banks still around lending money was the United States, U.S. banks had ended up lending the Entente over $10 billion throughout the course of the war. $10 billion alone was the equivalent of $147 billion in 2019. Okay? So that's a lot of money that's being lent out.